Well, Duncan, thank you very much for agreeing to do this interview today.
Well, it's a
For
pleasure
those of
to
you,
meet you virtually.
you too. Yeah, for people who haven't seen the channel before, I'm Nye from Finale Guitar in Sheffield. You're watching Folk Friend,
And
your
I'm
one-stop
Duncan
shop for Celtic
Cameron.
backing guitar. With me today, not in the studio, but online via Zoom, I have Duncan Cameron, who is a Canadian musician and runs a YouTube channel which I've been bootlegging for my video resources for a long time now. But he's also well known as a singer and a multi-instrumentalist. And so, yeah, thank you very much for coming on today.
Well, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Would you mind just telling us a little bit about how you got into folk music and what you're kind of playing these days?
Right, I will. So, I got my start because my parents were very musical. My father, in particular, he was born in Scotland, and then he got very involved in the folk music scene in Toronto, especially in the 70s. And he was part of a group um, called the Friends of Fiddler's Green, uh, a band that included mostly Brits. Um, and so he specialized in Scottish, Irish, and English music. Um, and when I went to school, I went to school in French immersion, and my mother's heritage is mixed cultures, but she has some French Canadian heritage as well. And so I grew up going to festivals and hearing all kinds of folk music, and I particularly liked French Canadian music and Irish music. I was very drawn to the fiddle, which was one instrument that my father didn't play. So I had some lessons, and we had, of course, lots of recordings at home. My family moved from Toronto to Sudbury. Sudbury is a smaller city in Canada um, that at the time didn't have um, the vibrant folk scene that I had experienced as a small boy in Toronto. So we kind of had to recreate it ourselves. So we had Cayleys at our house. We put on concerts. My father played in the school system for children, and we had a family band. So that was my start.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, and my sister plays as well. Her name is Moira Cameron. I don't see her very often because she lives way on the other side of the country, and Canada's quite a large country. She lives in Yellowknife.
All right.
Um, yeah, so that was my start. But since I had gone to school in French, I really took an interest in French Canadian music, particularly music from bands such as Barde, Héritage, La Bottine Souriante and others.
Okay.
And I got to meet a few of those people growing up because my father not only performed at festivals, but he was the artistic director of a folk festival here in Sudbury.
Oh, brilliant. Your backstage passes.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah,
Oh, cool. Uh,
yeah.
this is something I really wanted to ask you about because I'm sort of familiar with French traditional music, but I
Hmm.
don't know anything about the sort of, well, French Canadian connection. And really, there's so many different styles that you're involved in, which are sort of, some of them are connected in their heritage to Celtic music, and some of them aren't. So I suppose really I'd be really interested to know what your thoughts are on the differences and the similarities between these kinds of music and where in their roots that comes from, um,
Yeah,
between the
yeah.
styles
Well,
that
I'm
you're
very
involved in.
interested in that as well.
Yeah, oh, that's good.
Yeah. Um, well, I mean, I guess um, when I was growing up, I had kind of a romantic notion of folk music, which was popularized by Pete Seeger and others. That folk music is music of the people, by the people, and for the people.
Mm.
Um, but I guess I learned over time that it's actually not very unifying. Folk music is very regional,
Yeah.
and Canada is a big country, and it tends to be very regional as well.
Mm.
So, I mean, even if you were to talk about something very specific, such as Canadian fiddle music, you would have vastly different ideas of what that is, depending on where you grew up and what kind of music you were exposed to.
All right.
So, for example, in Canada, we're very proud of our Cape Breton fiddle tradition, which is spectacular. Um, but there is a French Canadian tradition which is quite different. There's an Ottawa Valley tradition. The Ottawa Valley is the region that separates Ontario, or borders Ontario and Quebec. And it's interesting because a lot of Irish people emigrated there, but of course there's a lot of French Canadian influence as well.
Mm.
So that's another aspect of fiddle music in Canada. And then there's Newfoundland music, which has a strong Irish influence as well, but particularly um, from the southwest of Ireland. So I think polkas and slides had much more of an influence in that part of the province than, for example, in the Ottawa Valley or in Cape Breton, where there's also an Irish influence.
That's an area to avoid for the tired armed backing guitarist then. Don't go
Yes, yeah,
there. Yeah. So
sure.
do you hear these sorts of would you say there's kind of noticeable elements of Celtic music and noticeable elements of music maybe from other regions which have kind of merged together in the modern music of that's coming from those areas? Or, and if so, have you
Yes,
got any thoughts on what are the kind of hallmarks of those different traditions and how you can hear them?
yeah. Well, the main thought that I have is that the instruments that are played have a very large effect on the kind of music that's created,
Mm.
the kind of composition that there is. For example, Celtic music is a big influence on American traditional music from the Appalachian Mountains and in bluegrass. But even some, I can't think of a particular example. Maybe I will in a minute. But very often you can have the same tune or a tune with the same origin that is found in um, the mountains of North Carolina or something like that,
Hmm.
and the accompaniment will be um, I would say more predictable. I mean, the guitar chords will linger for much longer, and they'll have like a 5/1 um, cadence at the end, whereas in
Like the 5/1.
yeah, yeah. Whereas you might have the same melody um, played in Ireland, and the accompaniment will be quite different depending on who's playing it.
Mm.
Um, and I think that's because the guitar is more of a recent addition to the tradition of playing Irish traditional music, whereas in the States it's been there longer and it's sort of integrated more.
Ah, now that's an interesting point, which I hadn't really thought of, because of course the guitar's been in the States for as long as the fiddle's been in the States, I suppose, hasn't it? Because it came with the Spanish from,
Yeah, indeed.
well, from Spain, obviously, but via
Hmm.
like from North Africa and then via Spain and then to the States, isn't it?
Right, right.
I'd never thought about that because there's a thing a lot of people, I see a lot of argument between sort of more traditionalist, harmonic traditionalists, if you like, who like
Okay.
B, G, and A, potentially B minor, E minor, um, but definitely no D major seven, and certainly no awful D9s or A13s or anything like that, you know.
Uh-huh, uh-huh.
Um, and I've had interesting conversations recently. I interviewed a guy called Jordan Lively, who's
Hmm.
he actually won Belfast Guitar Festival's Young Fingerstyle Guitarist of the Year a few years back. So he's um, quite well known as a fingerstyle guitarist, and he has lessons with Tony Mc Manus as well, who's I don't know if you've heard of him. He's sort of another,
Yes, who lives in Canada?
yeah. He lives in Canada.
Yeah, yeah, he lives in Fergus, Ontario, which is
Ah,
yeah. So I've run into him a few times.
oh, there we go. Yeah, this is obviously the place to be over there. Um, yeah, well, he was saying some regions of Ireland, even, or between Northern Ireland and Ireland, some regions are much more open to these kind of jazzy accompaniments, and some
Hmm.
regions really don't like anything complicated because they say people say it detracts from the tune, and the tune's the most important thing, you know. Um,
Yes, well, I think that's very interesting because I mean, if you take Martin Hayes and Dennis Cahill, for example,
mm,
very simple accompaniment. You know, you're not gonna get a lot of jazz chords there, despite the inventiveness of both musicians.
yeah,
Um, and you know, that's not by accident, that's by intent. I think they both figured out that to bring out the emotion and the spirit that they were going for, things have to remain kind of open sounding, kind of austere in a way.
yeah, yeah. It
Uh,
is interesting the range of approaches that you see because, as you say, in the Celtic tradition, the guitar's only been there, you know, a few hundred years, I suppose, tops, really.
right.
Um, so yeah, there's so much scope for different ways of approaching it. And also because the music is modal and wasn't written with harmonic accompaniment in mind,
Right.
it doesn't necessarily lend itself so well to more modern approaches to harmony, which are based in kind of um, modern functional harmony, you know. So yeah, it's
Yeah.
an interesting one. And this brings us back to the thing about arpeggios, which we we secretly discussed before we started recording. Viewers, I'm sorry you don't get that's the behind the scenes director's cut version with the full
Sure.
arpeggio discussion.
Uh-huh.
Um, but yeah, this is one thing that I find interesting, which I'm sure you've got thoughts on. I kind of think that in one of the features of Celtic music that makes it so noticeably, so recognizably Celtic, even if it's Irish, Breton, Scottish, you know, but they all have these certain features. And one of those is that you rarely get a clearly outlined chord. You
Mm-hmm.
won't very often get an arpeggio of a chord unless it's the first chord or occasionally the fourth chord.
Mm-hmm.
But you don't get so much of this kind of thing that you get a lot of in classical music or or sort of English folk music, where it's had more, I imagine, more of a church influence. Um,
Yes.
you get a lot more very clearly outlined chords, and one bar very deliberately has to be one specific chord, and if it's not that, it kind of sounds wrong. You don't really get that in Celtic music, and I've always found that to be the thing that you hear and you recognize it as the Celtic sound in a way. Um,
Right, right. Well, that's very interesting. I think another factor there, and I'd be curious to hear if you have thought about this or if you agree. Um, I've found that many Celtic melodies can be condensed down to a pentatonic scale. Either they're strictly a pentatonic scale, or they have additional notes, but you could leave those out. You could exchange them with other notes that are strictly in the pentatonic scale. And if you're doing that, since you have fewer notes that you're actually playing with, then you have fewer options of arpeggios, obviously.
yeah, there's a guy I've discovered recently, Dr. Aindrias Hirt, and he's
Okay.
based in New Zealand.
Hmm.
Um, and he has written some absolutely fascinating papers about how Celtic music came to be based around the pentatonic in that way. And
Hmm.
he analysed the Fenian lays, songs from the Fenian cycle from the 1500s,
Hmm.
um, and from the note distribution in those, he basically concluded that there's often tunes where in the lower octave the I believe it's in, I forget the order, but in the lower octave the second and the sixth tend to be omitted, but they'll crop up more commonly in the higher octave.
Hmm.
And he's kind of extrapolated back from that that music might have come from a basis in the overtone scale. And his theory is that these kind of shepherd's trumpet type instruments that only play the overtone series were
Hmm.
used as the basis for a lot of the songs, as accompaniment for the songs, and that
Hmm.
their kind of scale that they can produce is probably where the scales of the songs came from.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, and I must say, it completely messed up my theory of how this stuff might have evolved in people in the first place, which I've been working on for several years.
Hmm.
Um, because to my mind, the overtones are not a natural thing which kind of pleases us because of our brain structure. I think we tend towards um, the simple triadic kind of scale, like 1, 3, 5, and
Hmm.
then potentially the second. It's quite easy to get the fourth from it, and then maybe the seventh is probably a recent addition. That's the kind of road I was working down, and
Hmm.
Mr. Hurt has come along with his much better researched theory than my one, and completely messed my one up. So that's frustrating, but there we are. It's an interesting read. So yeah, that is interesting. But yes, it is mostly pentatonic, and it does it makes your options a lot more varied as an accompanist as well, doesn't it?
Oh, certainly, yeah, yeah. Um, which I find very refreshing about Celtic music, and sometimes difficult to teach and difficult to explain, because if you haven't grown up with Celtic music, I'm sure you've been exposed to many other kinds of music, and most other kinds of music, especially popular music, is is stacked in the opposite order. In other words, the accompaniment forms the foundation, and the melody can be kind of improvised. Whereas in Celtic music, it's the melody that's really the foundation of it, and the accompaniment, has tons of different options. I think it's a challenge for people to start thinking that way, but it's very rewarding, obviously, if you can.
Yeah, it's difficult when you say to somebody, "Oh, you can play D, and then this bit kind of has to be G, and this bit kind of has to be A." But instead
Hmm.
of D, you can also play G or B minor or E minor,
Hmm.
potentially C sharp if you're in a hurry. If you know. And it seems like it's kind of infinite options in a lot of ways, doesn't it?
Hmm. Hmm.
But how do you tackle that? What's your approach to it to sort of teach that feeling of
Well, the most important thing is assessing the level of the student or the group that I'm addressing. Um, very often people want a quick option that they can get started on right away,
mm,
and for that, um, I'm perfectly satisfied to go the way that you might approach a pop song, which is just to say these are the chords, just learn them.
yeah,
um, but if the group is more advanced or there's um, an opportunity to spend more time on a particular piece, you can say, well, here's the basic structure, but from here, there's kind of two directions you can go in. You can actually simplify it so it's more drone-like, so it's just really reinforcing the tonic, or um, you can use uh, inversions and alternate chords and bring out different flavors and that that in an intermediate group that option can be prescribed as well. You can say, all right, now you know the basic chords, we're going to do these ones which are alternates. But if you get a bit more advanced than that, you can say, well, here's why these ones work. And to understand why, you actually have to know the melody. You actually have to know each individual note in the melody.
mm,
Um, and you have to have some theory. You have to know what notes are actually contained in chords.
absolutely. Just one thing I tend to say to people as well when you're talking about picking chords by ear for tunes that you don't necessarily know very well. You were saying you can kind of think of them as an outline, which is usually pentatonic.
Hmm.
Um, Generally, for chord picking for the Celtic music, because you don't get many clearly defined chords within the melodies, I always think you can sort of hear just the dominant, just the foot tap beats, the dominant beats
Right.
as a little kind of outline of the tune, and base a lot of your um, harmony choices on that. And I think that's the kind of
Hmm.
good starting point for trying to teach the feeling of where chords go.
Yes, absolutely. But a danger there that I think creeps up sometimes, and this links back to um, we had sort of touched on the interesting differences between Celtic music and other styles of music. One difference that I observe is that um, in a lot of styles of music, it's since the accompaniment is intended to be the foundation, the melody is very square. Like it'll be two bars of this chord, two bars of the next chord, and it'll be predictable that way.
Mm,
Whereas if you get an old Irish melody, since it's created the opposite way with the melody as the foundation, there's no reason that it should stay on that chord for two bars or
yeah,
even one bar.
yeah,
So yeah, it can be a bit tricky if you expect things to be square, because very often they're not.
yeah. I like that. Celtic music is not square.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
That's a term that we actually use in Canada very often because
Oh,
both in French Canadian music and in Newfoundland music, there's the opposite of extreme of square, which is called crooked. And for crooked tunes, not only do the chords uh, last for different durations, but the actual meter of the song, the time signature changes.
oh,
So You'll have a tune that goes 1 2 1 2 1 2 3 1 2 1 2 3 1. It'll be kind of
Ah,
random like that.
that's interesting. Is that
Hmm.
to fit with certain dance forms then, or is that just at the whim of the melody writer?
I think it's both. I think, uh, well, it's three factors. It could be some dances that co-evolved with the melody. I think that's probably rare. Um, I think certainly there is in, intent of the composer to just mess with people's brains.
Yeah,
And thirdly, many parts of Canada are very isolated or have been in the past. And so you might get someone who was very keen on playing the fiddle but didn't have dancers to play for, or didn't have accompanists to play with, or didn't have even other fiddlers to play with. And so they would play the tune kind of the way they remembered, and things got corrupted and got interesting.
yeah. Oh, that is interesting. Is
Hmm.
there, would you say, because I really don't know anything about the sort of traditions of Canada, if you like. Um,
Hmm.
is there more variation in these sorts of crooked structures then? Is that a common thing? Um,
Yes, but it tends to be a regional thing. I mean, you wouldn't find crooked tunes in Ontario. They tend to be from Quebec and Newfoundland.
right, okay. More isolated areas historically.
Yeah, I suppose. Yeah.
Oh, wow, that's interesting. Oh. I know one thing that you wanted to talk about was the different tunings available and how they affect your kind of your options and the style of your accompaniment.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, yeah, I mean, I've recently started doing more videos about dadgad because obviously it's massively popular tuning,
Right.
and I generally play in standard because I find it the easiest to sort of think about how I could add the extra notes that you want within your chords, or trying to fit melodies over tunes and
Hmm.
things as well. I know you use all sorts, don't you? What's your favorite tuning?
It does vary from day to day, and it depends on the piece that I want to accompany. I do find Dadgad works very nicely for traditional Irish music. Um, it's not used very much in Cape Breton music or French Canadian music. Um, so I guess that's the short answer. It varies a bit what my preference is.
Mm,
Obviously, having a bass D string makes a lot of sense for many of these repertoires because um, fiddle tunes tend to have, well, either in the key of D or in the key of G, so D ends up being the five. So yeah, it's a useful thing to have that note as your bass.
mm.
Um, but Dadgad is particularly nice because, well, it's more drony. There's a guitarist in Canada by the name of Don Ross who's very innovative and a virtuoso.
Yeah,
And he, I had the opportunity to play with him a few times, and he referred to Dadgad as instant Celtic.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Um, it's a great thing for beginners because it's almost impossible to sound bad when you're playing in Dadgad.
yeah, yeah. Never that bad.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and that's. I must say, I sort of personally, I kind of had a go at dadgad when I was probably about 11 or 12, and
Hmm.
was like, oh yeah, this is nice. It does this, and then I was trying to work out other things I could do with it, and I was kind of like, oh, it doesn't seem to do very much else other than sound folky all the time, you know.
Sure.
It's only really recently that I've actually discovered how much fun it is arranging fingerstyle in it because mainly because it's very easy. But
Hmm.
yeah, you can have a lot of fun with it in that regard, I think. Um,
Sure.
but
Well, another
it's
thing
hard to
that
make it not sound like Dadgad, isn't it?
that can be a problem. Yeah. Um, I mean, a lot of players who play in Dadgad basically play in the D shape all the time, and they just move the capo around, um, which can be very effective, but it does tend to make things all sound the same. Um, but there's another guitar player in Canada that I really admire. His name is Yann Falquet, and he plays mostly Quebecois music, but he plays exclusively in Dadgad. He plays in a group called Genticorum. Um, anyway, one reason that I find him very inspiring is that he doesn't use a capo that much. So he'll play in G and A and other keys, just using different shapes and playing up the neck.
Mm, that's brilliant. Yeah, because A particularly, I find A major quite difficult to get right in Dadgad. A lot
Well,
of the
it's
shapes are quite tricky that you sort of end up having to do.
I
Um,
find it's not too bad. Um, oh, there we go. It's in Dadgad
oh, it's in
already.
Dadgad. Look at that.
Um, so, for example, I use this shape for A, which is quite nice and bright. It actually doesn't have an E in it. It's all A's and one C sharp.
Oh,
But it's great because now A is the bass, and the chord can move around a bit.
that's interesting. Is that it?
Yeah, yeah,
Oh, that's lovely. And then you've got
yeah,
nice
yeah.
bassy E at the bottom.
Of course.
Oh, there we go. That's well useful.
Yeah,
Oh, and you've got that for A minor as well.
sure.
Ah, oh, that's cool.
And the other thing I do for a lot is this A chord that doesn't have a third in it but has E's in it. So so I'm actually using my thumb to get another bass A,
Yeah.
and and that can be a very strong. It's almost like it has more power without the C sharp in it.
Ah, class. Yeah. Are there any other tunings that you particularly use, or do you tend to?
Well, I mean, the two others that I would probably use the most would be standard tuning and drop D.
Mm,
And of course, drop D is um, what John Doyle uses, and a lot of Paul Brady accompaniment on those classic fiddle and flute albums is drop D as well, and it's just spectacular the way that he plays it.
is there any particular guidance for people who are kind of maybe starting out trying to pick which tuning is the best to start with? What's your top pick?
Um, well, I'd say the first step is just to listen to people, listen to recordings and see what you actually like, what inspires you. Um, and there's a lot to pick from, and there's more and more guitar players all the time kind of innovating.
Mm,
Um, but yeah, for me, my top picks for accompanying fiddle tunes would probably be Paul Brady and John Doyle.
Okay, yeah, yeah. John Doyle's done quite a lot of instructional material as well, hasn't he? That's kind of
Yeah,
widely available, of course.
yeah. As is the case with instrumental music, um, traditional songs are are built the same way. Still have the foundation of the melody before the chords.
Hmm.
Um, and this can make things very interesting because, well, they have lyrics as well, and the lyrics tell the story. And sometimes, in some songs, it's almost conversational. By that I mean, um, it's it's not like an Ed Sheeran song. It's not a certain number of bars
My
that are
God.
looped over and over. It's um, it's one phrase, and if you want to say it a certain way, you might need an extra beat or two. So that crookedness creeps into songs at least as often as it does into instrumental music.
Ah, yeah. This is an interesting point, particularly with the Celtic. Well, I only quote this one because it's the one that I know about, but with the Celtic tradition, very often the songs do tend to just have an extra bar here and there, or the singer
Right.
elongates one part. And a lot of the time it's unaccompanied anyway, isn't it? And this is another thing where there's kind of differing attitudes by area as well. Is should there
Hmm.
even be accompaniment for songs? If they're not kind of sing along songs where the accompaniment is clear what it should be.
Yeah,
Um,
I see. I think this is fascinating because, well, a lot of influences come to mind. Ewan McColl, for example, um, he never played an instrument, to my knowledge, but had vast repertoire of traditional songs and, of course, composed songs as well. And and I think it was always very clear to him that there were songs that shouldn't be accompanied.
hmm,
Um, and even in his partnership with Peggy Seeger, who is such an accomplished musician and has so many great ideas about accompaniment, she she agreed. There were songs that you just you just couldn't add an instrument in to make it better. Um, but it's interesting taking that partnership as an example because Peggy plays many instruments, including guitar and banjo, which are quite rhythmic, but also the English concertina, which is 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 more like pads. It's almost like an organ sometimes, and that can be so helpful for a singer who wants to sing more freely, or for the crookedness that we were talking about. You just let the chord linger until it's time for something else, and then you do it for whatever amount of time is necessary.
yeah, yeah, that is interesting. Yeah, there's probably a strong argument for more drone-based instruments as well, I suppose, with just more of a kind of drone feel. Um, I mean,
Yeah,
certainly with the Celtic music as well. I mean, the original accompaniment was just a drone. It was instruments like Ilium pipes and those kinds of things where it is just a drone and a melody,
right,
and
right.
all the kind of harmonic trappings are sort of extra, aren't they? I suppose potentially you could just throw in long chords here and there to emphasize a certain part or
Right,
uh,
right. And you hear that even in groups like the Dubliners. They'll sing the old triangle, and they'll have I don't know if that's the correct example. Maybe that was unaccompanied, but there are songs certainly that they sang that didn't have a strict meter. and yet they would strum a chord on the guitar or the banjo, and they'd let it linger until they did all the ornaments that they wanted to, and then they'd move on to the next chord.
Do you want to tell people about any upcoming gigs and things like that? Have you got any sort of concerts coming up or social
Well,
media and websites and things like that as well? This is the promotion spot.
all right. Um, yeah, I don't have a lot of gigs coming up. I do have some, but they're kind of private events. Like I'm playing in a senior's home. I'm playing a wedding or two. Um, so, some small things that are outdoor and socially distanced. Um, yeah, I suppose it's not the greatest time for self-promotion because there's not a whole lot that I can
Nothing to
do.
promote. Yeah, no, sorry, I haven't picked the best time to ask you this question, have I?
Yeah. But I do have a website, just duncancameron.com, and that'll list my publicly available gigs. And I
Mhm.
also have a Facebook page, so you'll see events posted there. It's
That's
it's
great.
Duncan Cameron Music, facebook.com/ Duncan Cameron Music.
And I suppose the thing that I really like to promote to people as well, because like I say, I've used your tune recordings for lots of different
Yeah,
demonstrations, and they've been really helpful. So thank you for those.
excellent.
What's the best place for people to find your recorded music? Do people buy
Um,
your recordings or?
yeah, well, there's a few options. I do have one solo album, which is called The Whistling Thief, and that's available on iTunes. Um, there's another album that I'm very proud of called Blue Drag. I was part of the Pierre Schryer band. Pierre Schryer is a French Canadian fiddler. That's also available on iTunes. Um, I have other music that's available on Bandcamp, so if you just look for Duncan Cameron there, you'll get to hear some of my recent stuff that hasn't been released on a physical disc or on iTunes. So that might be interesting. And there's of course my YouTube channel. There's a lot of fiddle stuff there, which is meant to be instructional. So it's a close up of the violin, and I play the tunes slowly and at speed, and you get an impression of what it should sound like, and you get a good look at the fingering, so you might be able to learn it.
Yeah, well,
Um,
that's an absolutely great resource for anyone that is learning the fiddle as well. It's really, really good.
yeah, well,
Yeah.
thank you. I'm glad it has been useful, and I hear that there's a group in New Zealand who has been making use of these videos as well.
Oh, it's good. It's really nice with the YouTube thing is that I never really realized when I started making first I started making a few videos for my own amusement just to show people strumming patterns,
Right.
and I did a few of them years and years ago. And I came back a few months later and they'd had loads of hits, and there's like people all over the world going, "Oh yeah, this is really helpful." It's really interesting that there's this huge kind of global community of people that want to learn this music from a little tiny island. Um,
Yeah, yeah.
and just to see how far it's gone with its kind of fairly simple conventions, but it's kind of I don't know, it's got a unique feeling, hasn't it, that seems to have exported well.
Well, absolutely. I mean, there are a number of factors there. One is that the people themselves have been exported to all
Yeah,
parts of the world.
yeah.
Um, and another is that the tradition is still evolving, and there are many people who are very creative, um, adding their little flavors. Actually, bringing it back to something that you had mentioned before, different approaches to accompanying tunes, and how it tended to be a regional thing, whether people really wanted to hear the jazz chords or just the straight triads.
Mm,
That can happen just by accident in one generation. Um, and you may be aware of this, but uh, Django Reinhardt just happened to be a huge influence on the guitar accompaniment of fiddle music, particularly in Shetland.
Ah,
Yeah,
that's
because
interesting.
the guitar players there, uh, you know, were listening to the radio, and the only thing that they could get was
French radio.
Yeah, exactly.
Huh. That's very interesting because I have noticed particularly Scotland seems to be churning out the bands who've got the most arranged and the most harmonically complex accompaniment for Celtic style music
Hmm.
everywhere at the moment. I, that
Hmm.
seems to me anyway. It seems to be the kind of general trend that the Scottish bands have got these very complicated and very orchestrated and often very jazzy kind of harmonic sections going on.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
maybe it's that that started it. Maybe that's
Yeah, that could have been the catalyst.
yeah.
The best accompanists are the best listeners. And I'm thinking of those amazing partnerships, um, like Denis Cahill and Martin Hayes, who blend together so perfectly, and you know, the music that comes up seems to be better than the sum of the parts.
Mm,
But Liz Carroll and John Doyle would be another example. I mean, the fire in her playing really needs John Doyle's digging in and playing those passing chords and getting those rhythms that he does. It's amazing. It's perfect for her playing.
yeah.
Um, and I'm also thinking of Donald Lunny. There's a couple of early Matt Malloy albums where he accompanies Matt Malloy, and it's just so beautiful because I mean his playing is very Matt Malloy's playing is very lyrical, but virtuosic as well. And Donald Lunny just has a way of not getting in the way at times, and at other times being very inventive and busy, and it's just the perfect thing.
Mm.
So in my opinion, yes, there are many possibilities, and you might as well do what you like, but
Just don't annoy
if
anyone
you're
while
the
you're
accompanist,
there.
your first job is to listen.
Yeah, that right there is basically the most important guitar lesson ever, isn't it? If you're the accompanist, your first job is to listen. Yeah, that should be on t-shirts and bumper stickers. Maybe actually that could be Folk Friends new t-shirt line. That might be the
Nice.
yeah. You heard it here first. Well, thank you very much, Duncan, for talking to us today.
Thank you.
If people want to check out your music, I will put some links in the box down below.
Very nice.
And they will also be in little cards in the corners as well throughout. So yeah,
Perfect.